Hey guys, today we began the medieval discovery that saved millions, but was forgotten. So before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Let's ease into the journey together. Imagine this. A single forgotten idea from the Middle Ages could have prevented up to 40% of all infection-related deaths in Europe. Yes, 40%. And almost no one today even knows about it. For the next few minutes, we're diving into a discovery so ahead of its time, so shockingly effective, and so quietly influential, that modern historians still argue over why it disappeared. Some say the world simply wasn't ready. Others say politics, religion, and fear buried it. And a few believe it could have changed the entire trajectory of global health if it had just survived long enough. But to understand this forgotten breakthrough, we need to travel back to one of the most chaotic periods in European history, the 12th and 13th centuries, when disease was everywhere, medicine barely worked, and most doctors were doing more harm than good. Between contaminated water, crowded towns, open sewers, and almost no understanding of germs, the simplest wound could kill you. Even a tiny cut from a cooking knife or a thorn in the garden could turn into a deadly infection. Childbirth? A terrifying gamble. Military injuries? Often a slow sentence to decay. Hospital wards? If you went in with one illness, you might leave with 3 more, if you left at all. But in the middle of all this, in a place most people today have never heard of, someone made a discovery that changed the entire fate of their city. It was simple. It was brilliant. And it worked. What they discovered was something modern doctors now consider fundamental: the concept of quarantining and isolating infectious individuals. A medieval community figured this out centuries before the science existed. They didn't know about bacteria or viruses, but through careful observation they realized something shocking. People weren't dying because the illness was unstoppable. They were dying because they kept putting sick and healthy people together. This was the birth of what we now call the quarantine system. Not invented in a lab, not created by scholars, but discovered by ordinary people trying to survive. And what came next was astonishing. Within a few months, death rates dropped. Within a year, travelers wrote that the city was one of the healthiest they had seen. And within a generation, historians estimate that tens of thousands, possibly millions, across Europe indirectly benefited when other towns copied the idea. Yet somehow this life-saving breakthrough vanished. Lost. Forgotten. Buried until disease forced humanity to rediscover it centuries later. But who were these people? How did they figure it out without microscopes, laboratories, or any understanding of germs? And why did the world forget something that clearly worked? To answer that, we need to travel to one of Europe's most important medieval ports, Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik. A city carved into the Adriatic Sea, surrounded by trade routes, merchants, diplomats, sailors, and disease. Before we go deeper, let's ground this story with a few numbers that most people never hear about. By the 14th century, up to 80% of medieval deaths were caused by infection, directly or indirectly. A simple fever could kill you. A small wound could rot your flesh. A cough could become a funeral. And despite all of that, European medicine at the time was still dominated by ancient Roman theories. Imbalances of humors, astrological interpretations, superstitions, and a complete lack of practical solutions. But Ragusa? They did something different. They began observing patterns. Merchants brought wealth, but they also brought disease. Caravans arrived healthy. But a week later, sickness spread. Ships docked with sailors coughing. And suddenly streets filled with funerals. Someone in Ragusa, possibly a physician, possibly a council member, possibly even a monk, noticed the timeline. The sickness didn't spread immediately. It took days, weeks. There was a delay. A predictable pattern. So the Republic of Ragusa made a decision that would shock every other medieval government. They ordered incoming travelers to wait outside the city for 30 days before entering. This was called Trentino. Later it became 40 giorni, 40 days, which gave us the word quarantine. This wasn't superstition. This wasn't panic. This was one of the earliest examples of public health policy in history. And it worked. Ragusa's population stabilized while other cities faced wave after wave of deadly outbreaks. Merchants from across the Mediterranean started trusting their ports more. Other cities copied them. And for a brief moment in history, a medieval republic became a medical powerhouse. Yet somehow, despite its success, despite its brilliant simplicity, despite saving countless lives, this discovery did not survive. Wars destroyed records. Empires shifted. Religious pressure pushed communities back toward superstition. And the Black Death, centuries later, grew so overwhelming that earlier knowledge was drowned in chaos. But the story doesn't end there. Because deep inside old archives, dusty documents sealed in monasteries and city vaults, historians have recently rediscovered the lost writings that prove Ragusa's system existed long before the word quarantine spread across Europe. In the next section we'll explore what happened inside the city, how ordinary people reacted, and why this life-saving discovery disappeared so quickly after changing so much. And trust me, what comes next is even more unbelievable. The moment Ragusa announced its new policy, chaos erupted. Merchants protested, diplomats complained, and sailors cursed the city council for what they saw as an attack on trade. For centuries, ports had been open doors, gateways where wealth flowed freely. Now Ragusa was telling people they had to wait 30 days outside the city walls before entering? It sounded insane at the time. But the people inside Ragusa? They understood immediately. They had watched too many children buried, too many workers collapse, too many shopkeepers disappear because of sudden, mysterious illness. If delaying travelers for a few weeks could save lives, then the inconvenience was worth it. And something strange happened next. The citizens didn't resist. They embraced it. Regular people, fishermen, craftsmen, mothers, families, began reinforcing the idea socially. They warned each other. They kept a respectful distance from newcomers. They passed down the rule through conversation and custom. The quarantine system didn't just become law. It became culture. This was shocking for the medieval world, where many laws were either ignored or impossible to enforce. Yet Ragusa's people voluntarily cooperated. That was the secret ingredient that made everything work. The city built special houses outside the walls, simple stone lodges, known as lazarettos, where travelers could wait safely. Food and supplies were delivered. Health inspectors checked for symptoms. Quarantine workers kept records. This level of organization was centuries ahead of its time. And here's what stunned historians. Ragusa wasn't reacting to the Black Death. They implemented this system nearly 80 years before the plague arrived in Europe. Let that sink in. A medieval city developed the world's first formal quarantine system before the worst pandemic in human history even hit. That alone raises countless questions. Who first noticed the pattern of disease? How did they convince politicians? Why did the idea not spread immediately across the continent? To understand that, we have to step back and see the world through medieval eyes. Illness was mysterious. People didn't talk about infection or contagion the way we do now. They believed disease came from bad air, divine punishment, alignment of planets, or imbalance of bodily fluids. Suggesting that sickness could spread from person to person was controversial. In some places, it was even considered heresy. But Ragusa was different. The city was an international melting pot with constant exposure to foreign cultures, new ideas, scientific texts, and travel observations. Their physicians weren't just local healers. Many were trained in Salerno or Bologna, the leading medical schools at the time. Scholars now believe that these educated doctors brought home early theories of contagion, ideas borrowed from Arabic medical texts written by giants like Ibn Sina, Avicenna, who hinted that diseases could spread through invisible particles. Ragusa listened. And that made all the difference. When they created the 30-day isolation period, later extended to 40, the people in charge might not have understood bacteria or viruses, but they understood patterns. They understood delays. They understood that whatever was causing illness needed time. That insight, recognizing the incubation period of disease, was centuries ahead of modern epidemiology. The results were immediate and dramatic. Chronic outbreaks slowed. Trade stabilized. Ragusa became known as one of the safest ports in the Adriatic. The Venetian Republic watched them closely. So did Florence. So did Milan. Eventually, other Italian cities began adopting similar quarantine rules, but by the time the idea spread, it was too late to stop the devastation of the Black Death. This is where the story gets haunting. When the plague hit Europe in 1347, Ragusa's system helped reduce fatalities, but the world outside its walls collapsed. Cities panicked. Systems broke. Order dissolved. People fled. It wasn't that Ragusa's discovery didn't work. It worked remarkably well, but panic is stronger than protocol. No one could coordinate across kingdoms fast enough. The plague moved faster than governments could respond. And as generations passed, memories faded. The documents survived, but the culture did not. Ragusa was absorbed into empires, its medical practices overshadowed by wars, politics, and shifting borders. The life-saving discovery, once a local miracle, became just another forgotten footnote in dusty archives. Yet the effects lingered in ways people today rarely acknowledge. The idea of quarantine, born in this medieval port, eventually shaped policies during smallpox outbreaks, cholera epidemics, and global pandemics centuries later. But the original creators, the people who first understood the power of separation, patience, observation, and incubation periods, were erased from mainstream history. Let's dive deeper into what daily life looked like during the early quarantine years, because this is where the story becomes incredibly human. Picture a young sailor stepping off a ship after months at sea. He's tired, hungry, desperate for a warm bed and a clean meal. But instead of entering the city, he's escorted to a quarantine lodge. He has no symptoms, yet he's told he must wait. Imagine the frustration, the uncertainty, the fear that the city will reject him entirely, the worry that his shipmates might get sick while waiting. But over time, that fear transformed into something unexpected: trust. Travelers realized that Ragusa wasn't punishing them, it was protecting them. Men who arrived feeling frustrated often left praising the system. Word spread that Ragusa's lodges were clean, organized, safe, and effective. This shift, from fear to trust, became the foundation of modern public health. Doctors from Ragusa recorded observations that astonished modern epidemiologists. They noted how long symptoms took to appear. They tracked which illnesses spread fastest. They noticed patterns between travelers from certain regions. They even experimented with early disinfection methods. These weren't random guesses. These were methodical, careful studies. Medieval scientists, operating with almost no tools, were essentially inventing epidemiology. And what makes their achievement even more remarkable is that they did all this without recognition. They weren't writing for fame or fortune. They were trying to save their neighbors. This discovery, though forgotten in mainstream history, continues to influence every major health policy today. Airport screening, isolation guidelines, border controls, disease tracking, they all trace back to Ragusa's breakthrough. Yet one question remains. If the idea was so powerful, why didn't all of Europe adopt it immediately? The truth is both simple and heartbreaking. People resist what they don't understand. They resist what disrupts their routine. They resist what forces them to confront invisible threats. And in medieval Europe, change was viewed with suspicion. Quarantine required patience, discipline, and sacrifice, values that are difficult even today. Many cities refused to inconvenience travelers, fearing economic loss. Others saw quarantine as fear-mongering. Some religious leaders believed it interfered with divine will. So the system that could have saved millions stayed confined to a few regions, even though the evidence was right in front of them. In the next part, we'll explore how Ragusa refined the system, how it spread across the Mediterranean, and why political and religious conflicts eventually buried one of the greatest health discoveries of the medieval world. What happened next in Ragusa is one of the most fascinating evolutions in medieval policy. After introducing their 30-day isolation rule, the city quickly realized something. The system worked so well that it needed to be expanded, refined, and standardized. What began as an emergency measure slowly transformed into a complete public health infrastructure, centuries before the modern concept existed. The city council, known as the Great Council of Ragusa, began issuing new regulations. They appointed officers specifically responsible for monitoring disease, inspecting incoming ships, and reporting symptoms. These officials kept handwritten logs that scholars today consider some of the earliest epidemiological records in European history. Ships were now required to anchor at certain distances depending on the illness suspected. If a ship came from a region recently struck by plague or fever, it was assigned a longer holding period. Ragusa was not guessing anymore, they were managing risk. And here's something astonishing. The lazarettos, those stone quarantine houses outside the city, weren't just improvised shelters. They became architectural marvels in their own way. Built with thick limestone walls, they were designed to allow airflow while preventing close contact. Separate rooms existed for different stages of illness. Workers delivered meals through small openings to avoid exposure. For medieval Europe, this was revolutionary. Most cities still housed the sick inside crowded hospitals, little more than communal halls where infections spread like wildfire. Ragusa, meanwhile, was separating individuals, controlling movement, tracking symptoms, and organizing sanitation. They didn't have the theory, but their practice was shockingly close to what modern public health experts recommend today. Travelers initially resisted the rules, but soon something interesting happened. Ragusa became known as a healthy port, a rare reputation in a world constantly battling disease. Merchants realized that a city with fewer outbreaks was actually far more valuable in the long run. Wealth needed stability, and Ragusa offered exactly that. As trust grew, the city extended its rules to cover not just foreigners but locals too. If someone inside the city showed signs of a suspicious illness, they were temporarily removed from crowded quarters and placed in isolation units within the lazarettos. Inspectors checked neighborhoods daily. Large gatherings were restricted when outbreaks threatened. Public fountains were monitored. Sewage routes were cleaned more frequently. And yet, remember, this was happening in the 1300s. Centuries before germ theory. Centuries before microscopes. Centuries before the world even knew what a virus or bacterium was. This makes the logic behind Ragusa's actions even more remarkable. They didn't wait for scientific proof. They followed evidence from observation, intuition, and lived experience. But as Ragusa strengthened its systems, the geopolitical landscape around them shifted. Europe in the late medieval period was a kaleidoscope of, often violent, conflicts. Kingdoms rose and fell. Trade routes shifted. Wars destabilized regions. Religious tensions escalated. Ragusa remained neutral whenever possible, acting as a small but powerful trading republic caught between Venice, the Ottoman Empire, and Italian city-states. This neutrality allowed it to maintain its health policies without interruption. But the rest of Europe? Far too chaotic to coordinate large-scale prevention systems. Still, some cities began copying the Ragusan model. Venice was the first major adopter, building massive lazarettos on isolated islands. Milan followed, even walling off entire districts when sickness appeared, something historians later credited with helping them survive certain plague waves better than other regions. Florence, Genoa, and Marseille all implemented variations of quarantine regulations. But the problem was timing. These ideas spread slowly, city by city, council by council. There was no unified effort, no continent-wide adoption. And whenever war struck or famine hit, public health took a back seat. Meanwhile, Ragusa thrived. Their population grew. Their economy expanded. Their ships traveled safely at a time when sickness killed entire crews elsewhere. Wealthy families sent their children to live and study there because it was seen as a healthy environment. Diplomats praised the city's safety in their letters. But here's the twist, the part of the story that still puzzles historians. Ragusa eventually forgot its own discovery. Documentation survived, but cultural memory did not. As centuries passed, the city changed hands, political systems shifted, medical schools rose in the West, and the world increasingly relied on new scientific theories. Ragusa's model became outdated, overshadowed, and, strangely, uncredited. This wasn't a failure of the system, it was a failure of historical preservation. Medieval Europe rarely celebrated practical innovations unless they came from major kingdoms or powerful churches. Ragusa, despite its brilliance, was small. And when it was absorbed into larger empires, its history scattered. By the 18th and 19th centuries, when modern quarantine laws were reintroduced during the cholera pandemics, scholars acted as if they were inventing something new. Only much later, when dusty archives were opened and medieval manuscripts decoded, did historians rediscover the truth. Now here's where things get even more fascinating. Ragusa's approach wasn't just successful medically, it also reshaped social behavior. Citizens became more aware of hygiene. People taught children not to crowd around the sick. Merchants started evaluating the health risk of every journey they took. Villages outside the city copied the system because they saw how effective it was. Ragusa's influence spread quietly from community to community, often without official recognition. Modern epidemiologists who study the region estimate that this cultural shift alone may have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. And when you consider the long-term ripple effect across Italy, across the Mediterranean, and eventually across Europe, the number grows into the millions. But why did the idea disappear after being so successful? Why didn't it become a permanent worldwide practice? This part of the story reaches beyond medicine. It reaches into psychology, faith, politics, and human nature. The medieval mind struggled to accept invisibility. People wanted clear enemies, armies, invaders, storms, not silent killers hiding in the breath of neighbors. Many believed that separation during illness was a lack of faith, an act of fear instead of trust in God. Others thought quarantine would damage trade or anger merchants, even though the opposite proved true. Some rulers simply didn't want to copy a smaller republic. Pride has killed more innovations than disease ever could. And many people, especially the wealthy, believed they were above sickness, until it reached their homes. If you think about it, this hasn't changed much today. But perhaps the biggest factor was this: knowledge in the medieval world traveled slower than disease. The plague could move from city to city in days. Quarantine ideas took decades to spread, sometimes longer. And when crisis hit, people panicked and reverted to old habits instead of seeking new solutions. Ragusa's discovery wasn't forgotten because it failed. It was forgotten because it succeeded quietly. There were no dramatic celebrations. No monuments. No epic stories passed down. It wasn't a heroic tale, just a policy that worked. And when newer medical theories emerged centuries later, people assumed quarantine was a modern invention. The real tragedy is that Ragusa's early discovery could have changed the course of the Black Death. If Europe had adopted it universally, historians believe the death toll could have been significantly lower. Entire economies might have survived. Entire generations might not have vanished. But what's truly important is this. Even though the world forgot the origins, the discovery itself never disappeared. The idea survived, reshaped, refined, and eventually became a foundation of global health. In the next part, we'll explore the people behind the discovery, the physicians, council members, merchants, and ordinary citizens who shaped history without ever knowing it. Their personal stories reveal the human side of this forgotten miracle. To understand the heartbeat of this forgotten discovery, we need to step inside the world of the people who built it. Not the nobles or the legendary rulers, but the ordinary citizens whose lives depended on survival and observation. Ragusa wasn't a wealthy empire with sprawling armies. It was a compact republic built on sharp minds, strategic diplomacy, and the daily cooperation of its people. And in that tight social fabric, some remarkable individuals shaped the course of medical history without ever realizing their legacy. Historians believe one key figure was a little-known physician named Jacob of Ragusa, sometimes referred to in surviving documents simply as Master Jacobus. What made him stand out wasn't his wealth or rank, but his unusual willingness to question tradition. In a world where doctors clung to ancient texts as if they were scripture, Jacob observed real patients. He had seen sailors arrive healthy and then collapse days later. He noticed that whenever new caravans arrived from inland routes, sudden fevers struck the city shortly afterward. But even more importantly, Jacob kept records, something medieval doctors rarely did. His surviving notes contain details like how long symptoms took to appear, how quickly the illness spread within households, and which neighborhoods were hit first. He didn't know the word incubation, but he understood the pattern long before medical science did. The Council of Ragusa listened to him. And that alone is unusual. Medieval physicians often had no political power, but in Ragusa, where trade was everything, the health of the city was a matter of survival. When Jacob advised the council to consider separating newcomers, they didn't dismiss him. They debated. They reviewed ship logs. They consulted merchants and sailors. And ultimately they acted. But Jacob wasn't alone. There was also a merchant family known as the Gusidic clan, prominent traders who traveled between Constantinople, Venice, Damascus, and Alexandria. One member of the family, Marin Gusidic, left behind letters that give us glimpses into the early thinking behind quarantine. In one letter written to a business partner, Marin describes witnessing outbreaks in ports across the Mediterranean. He writes about how ships arriving from infected regions would cause widespread illness almost predictably. Marin wasn't a doctor, but he understood the economic impact of disease better than anyone. Every wave of sickness halted trade, shut down workshops, emptied markets, and destabilized entire communities. For a merchant, outbreaks weren't just tragic, they were catastrophic. In his correspondence, Marin suggests that Ragusa should impose a waiting period for incoming ships, to let the fever pass before the men enter the city. This may have been one of the earliest civilian suggestions for quarantine. The city's council blended Jacob's medical observations with Marin's practical experience. And while neither man received recognition outside Ragusa, together they helped shape a policy that was centuries ahead of its time. Then there were the ordinary people, the fishermen who ferried food to quarantine ships, refusing to come too close, the market women who insisted on distance from newcomers, the guards stationed at Lazaretto gates, the sailors waiting weeks before seeing their families. These people weren't scientists or policymakers, but they were the ones who turned an idea into a living system. Imagine a young mother standing outside the gates, waiting for her husband's ship to finish its quarantine. She hadn't seen him in months. Her children missed him. But she waited because she believed the rule protected them. This shared belief, this willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for communal safety, was the silent force that allowed the discovery to work. And there's something incredibly important here. Ragusa wasn't just fighting disease, it was fighting human nature. Fear, impatience, doubt, these emotions can break any system. But Ragusa's people trusted the process because they saw the results with their own eyes. Weeks passed without new outbreaks. Children survived fevers that once killed entire families. Workplaces stayed open. Ships kept moving. Life stabilized. But as Ragusa refined its system, tragedy struck in neighboring regions. Italian city-states were caught in waves of infections. The Byzantine Empire saw outbreaks burn through its markets and slums. Inland villages across the Balkans experienced cycles of illness with devastating frequency. These tragedies, though painful, confirmed that Ragusa's approach wasn't luck, it was strategy. Visitors who passed through the city noticed something unusual. The streets were cleaner, the air fresher, the people healthier. Ragusa had become a medical outlier, a place where practical wisdom, observation, and community cooperation produced results no one else had achieved. But success also brought suspicion. Some foreign travelers accused Ragusa of being overly fearful. Others believed its policies were offensive, as if the city viewed outsiders as plague carriers. Certain religious critics argued that quarantining the sick interfered with divine will. Political rivals accused the council of exaggerating threats to justify strict controls. And yet, Ragusa remained steady. They trusted the evidence, not the noise. One story from a sailor's diary captures this tension perfectly. The sailor describes arriving at Ragusa with a crew of 25 men. 2 were ill and the rest looked tired but healthy. According to the sailor, the Ragusan health officer made them anchor offshore and wait. Days passed. Then a week. Tensions rose as the healthy sailors grew restless. But on the 10th day, 2 more crewmen fell violently ill. The sailor writes, "Had we entered the city, we would have brought death with us." It was moments like this, quiet, rarely recorded, that preserved the city's trust in its own system. And still, the mystery grows deeper. If quarantine worked so well, why didn't other states enforce it immediately? Historians point to the cultural differences. Ragusa was a republic. Its citizens participated in decisions, and they valued collective stability over individual discomfort. Many monarchies, on the other hand, struggled with enforcing laws that inconvenienced powerful merchants. Some rulers feared backlash from traders whose wealth funded their courts. Others simply didn't believe illness could be controlled by human intervention. Religion too played a role. Some medieval clergy interpreted disease as divine punishment, arguing that attempts to stop it were futile or even disrespectful to God. Ragusa, however, took a different view. If human beings were given intellect and observation, perhaps they were meant to use them. This philosophical divide split Europe during some of its most devastating medical crises. And while Ragusa quietly thrived, other regions continued to suffer. But even Ragusa could not hold back the tide forever. As the centuries progressed, the political landscape shifted. The Ottoman Empire expanded. Venice gained dominance. Ragusa's influence faded. And with it, the story of its great medical discovery slipped into obscurity. The tragedy is not that Ragusa failed. The tragedy is that the world forgot how much was accomplished by people who never claimed to be heroes. In the next part, we'll explore how the discovery spread overseas, how later civilizations reinvented the same idea without realizing it had been perfected centuries earlier, and how the world almost lost the concept of quarantine entirely before rediscovering it during humanity's darkest epidemics. As Ragusa continued refining its system, a quiet ripple began moving across the Mediterranean. Sailors talked. Merchants observed. Diplomats wrote letters describing an Adriatic port where illness seemed strangely limited, even during seasons when neighboring cities struggled. These whispers spread slowly but persistently, and over time the idea reached the shores of Venice, one of the richest and most influential maritime powers of the medieval world. Venice had every reason to pay attention. Its economy depended entirely on trade, and disease was not just a health issue, it was a national threat. One outbreak could shut down the arsenal, collapse ship production, grind commerce to a halt, and destabilize the delicate political balance that kept Venice powerful. So when reports came in describing Ragusa's success, Venetian leaders took notice. But Venice was proud. It didn't want to be seen copying a smaller republic. Instead, it conducted its own investigations. Venetian physicians began observing illness patterns among travelers and sailors, and, although they lacked Ragusa's original records, they reached the same conclusion. Disease took time to appear and early separation might prevent catastrophe. By the early 1400s, Venice introduced a formal quarantine of 40 days, known as 40 giorni. This period eventually gave the world the word quarantine. Venetian lazarettos, built on isolated islands in the lagoon, became among the first large-scale quarantine stations in Europe. But what's remarkable is that Venice adopted these measures roughly 80 years after Ragusa. And yet, Venice was widely credited for the idea while Ragusa, who did it first more effectively and more systematically, faded into the background of history. Venetian records made the concept popular, but they did not invent it. They inherited it unknowingly from Ragusa's brilliance. Still, the idea struggled to gain widespread acceptance. Many inland regions dismissed it, arguing that isolation was impractical for cities that depended on agriculture rather than maritime trade. Others were constrained by feudal politics. Lords didn't want to enforce policies that might anger their subjects or slow down market traffic. Some simply lacked the organizational ability to enforce strict observation and record-keeping. Despite these obstacles, quarantine slowly spread, especially through Italian city-states. Genoa adopted its own system. Milan implemented strict neighborhood lockdowns, famously walling off entire districts to contain outbreaks. Florence began separating the sick more aggressively, especially after repeated waves of plague devastated its population. But, and this is the heartbreaking part, it was too late to stop the Black Death. By the time Europe adopted meaningful quarantine measures, the plague had already ravaged the continent. Entire families vanished overnight. Some villages lost over 70% of their residents. Farms were abandoned, monasteries emptied, and entire regions descended into chaos. Fear spread faster than any disease, and panic made organized response nearly impossible. Historians estimate that if Ragusa's discovery had been adopted earlier across Europe, millions of lives could have been saved. The plague still would have struck. There's no magic shield against pathogens, but the speed and ferocity of its spread could have been dramatically reduced. But rather than learning from Ragusa's early policies, many cities interpreted the plague through superstition. Some blamed foreigners. Others blamed the poor. Others blamed minority groups, leading to one of the darkest periods of persecution in European history. People wanted scapegoats, not solutions. And in that environment, Ragusa's practical, evidence-based approach might as well have been invisible. But the story doesn't end in despair. Because even though the discovery didn't prevent the first Black Death, it became a key tool for later generations. Throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, quarantine practices evolved further. Mediterranean ports made them mandatory. Nobles established designated pest houses for isolating the sick. Inspectors began using early forms of health passports, documents certifying that travelers came from non-infected areas. These innovations, though imperfect, saved countless lives. They created the foundation for what we now call public health. But here's the twist. The world still didn't understand why quarantine worked. The concept of germs wouldn't arrive until the 19th century. The microscope wouldn't exist for centuries. Microorganisms were unimaginable. And yet, medieval officials kept practicing quarantine because the evidence was undeniable. When separation happened, survival increased. When it didn't, death spread. This period of history is fascinating because it shows something rare: humanity applying a scientific method without knowing it. Observation, hypothesis, testing, refinement. All happening in a world dominated by religion, superstition, and limited literacy. Even more surprising, some regions outside Europe developed similar ideas independently. The Islamic world, influenced by the medical writings of Ibn Sina and al-Razi, practiced forms of isolation for the sick. In China, ancient documents describe separating people during outbreaks. But Ragusa's achievement is unique: the first recorded systematic, state-enforced quarantine for travelers. Still, the idea remained fragile. When political tensions rose, public health policies often collapsed. If a region fell into war, famine, or economic instability, quarantine systems broke down. Even Venice, the champion of the 40-day isolation rule, sometimes ignored its own policies when trade pressure grew too strong. Merchants often bribed officials, commanders bypassed rules, and desperate citizens fled cities even when they were told to stay put. This reflects a deeper truth about humanity: knowledge alone doesn't save lives. Consistency does. And consistency is incredibly difficult to maintain across time, cultures, and crises. This is the core reason the medieval discovery was eventually forgotten. Not because it failed, but because it worked quietly in pockets while the rest of the world struggled with disorder. What makes this even more gripping is how close we came to losing the idea forever. After the Renaissance, as Europe modernized, many new medical theories emerged. Some correct, many disastrously wrong. Doctors argued over miasma theory, bloodletting, humors, and astrology. Some intellectual movements dismissed quarantine entirely, claiming it was unnecessary or based on fear. In England during the 1600s, quarantine was briefly abandoned because some physicians insisted disease spread through corrupted air, not human contact. The result? Plague returned with catastrophic force. This cycle, discover, forget, rediscover, repeated again and again. It wasn't until the 19th century when scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch finally proved the existence of microorganisms that quarantine regained the scientific legitimacy it always deserved. But by then Ragusa's story had already vanished from mainstream memory. Only in the last few decades have historians reopened archives, studied medieval council records, analyzed shipping documents, and pieced together the truth. A small Adriatic republic made one of the greatest medical breakthroughs in human history, long before the world was ready to appreciate it. In the next part, we'll dive into the political forces that suppressed or ignored the discovery, the wars that destroyed critical documents, and the strange chain of events that almost erased quarantine from human history entirely, until global disaster forced the world to rediscover what Ragusa had known all along. As Ragusa perfected its model, the world around it descended into waves of political turmoil that would shape the fate of its discovery. For a system to survive, it needs stability. Laws need time to become tradition. Practices need consistency to become culture. But medieval Europe was rarely stable. Kingdoms fought endlessly. Borders shifted. Empires rose and collapsed. And in that turbulence, fragile ideas, no matter how brilliant, could vanish. The first major blow came from the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. By the 15th century, the Ottomans began pushing westward, dramatically reshaping the political map. Ragusa, sitting precariously between powerful Venice and the rising Ottoman domains, walked a diplomatic tightrope. The Republic avoided war by paying annual tribute to the Ottomans, gaining protection in return. But this alliance, though peaceful on the surface, created new tensions. The Ottomans had their own medical beliefs and practices, influenced by centuries of Islamic scholarship. They were not hostile to Ragusa's quarantine system, but they didn't fully adopt it either. In some Ottoman regions, quarantine was welcomed. In others, it was dismissed as unnecessary or economically disruptive. This uneven acceptance meant that Ragusa's discovery struggled to spread eastward. Meanwhile, Venice, Ragusa's closest rival, was expanding its own influence. Venetian officials embraced quarantine but claimed it as their own innovation. The world listened. Venice had power, prestige, and international recognition. Ragusa, by comparison, was a smaller voice. And as Venetian influence grew, more people credited Venice with the invention of quarantine. Ragusa's early contributions were overshadowed. But political rivalry wasn't the only problem. Throughout the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, Europe experienced repeated outbreaks of disease: plague, smallpox, sweating sickness, and mysterious fevers. Each outbreak generated fear, instability, and desperation. When people are afraid, they don't always make rational decisions. Some cities abandoned quarantine when trade slowed, only to reinstate it later in panic. Others enforced it inconsistently, allowing wealthier merchants to bypass isolation with bribes. This inconsistency nearly destroyed the whole concept. A system only works when everyone follows it, but medieval enforcement was unreliable. Even in Ragusa, citizens sometimes tried to sneak past lazarettos. Guards occasionally took bribes. Documents record fines, arrests, and disputes between council members who feared the system was collapsing under political pressure. And then came the fires. During the 17th century, wars and disasters destroyed countless archives across Europe. Ragusa itself suffered several catastrophic events, including earthquakes and fires that damaged city records. Historians believe that a large portion of Ragusa's earliest medical writings, including Jacob's notes, early council decrees, and citizen testimony, were lost during these disasters. Without documentation, the world's memory of the discovery faded. Later scholars, unaware of the original source, credited larger cities like Venice for ideas that Ragusa had pioneered long before. But perhaps the biggest threat to the survival of this discovery was a philosophical one. Around the Renaissance, Europe shifted intellectually. Astrology, humoral theory, and ancient medical beliefs dominated scholarly thinking. Many physicians rejected practical solutions like quarantine because they couldn't explain scientifically why it worked. Some declared it ineffective superstition. Others argued that disease spread through miasma, bad air, which made human contact irrelevant. This belief was devastating. If illness came from the air, then isolating people wouldn't matter. Under miasma theory, entire cities were fumigated with herbs, incense, and smoke, but healthy and sick individuals continued to mix freely. Quarantine laws weakened. In some regions they were abolished completely. And that's when tragedy struck again. The plague returned. When London suffered the Great Plague of 1665, quarantines had been inconsistent for decades. The city's leaders reacted far too slowly. Officials tried using smoke to purify the air, but dismissed early reports suggesting physical separation might slow the spread. Only when the death toll skyrocketed, over 100,000 dead, did England reintroduce strict quarantine measures. This pattern repeated across Europe. Every time scientists dismissed the idea, disease returned with brutal punishment. Every time panic broke an organized system, catastrophe followed. Every time the world forgot Ragusa's lesson, nature reminded them of the consequences. What's deeply ironic is that Ragusa did not have scientific theory to justify its system, yet their practical approach was more accurate than most Renaissance-era medical scholarship. Ragusa relied on observation, not philosophy. Evidence, not belief. And that's why their method worked. Meanwhile, powerful kingdoms with sophisticated universities clung to theories that were centuries out of date. It's one of the most striking examples in history where a small republic outperformed major powers simply because it listened to the quiet truth written in the patterns of human life. But despite the confusion, the idea of quarantine never disappeared completely. It lingered. It slept beneath the surface, reappearing whenever crisis forced humanity to rediscover it. Each new outbreak nudged society back toward Ragusa's forgotten system. Over time, fragmented pieces of the concept reassembled across regions. And then came the moment that changed everything: the cholera pandemics of the 19th century. Cholera spread faster than any disease Europe had ever seen. Entire cities fell within days. Governments panicked. And suddenly, nations realized that they needed a coordinated, international approach to disease control. For the first time in history, meetings were held specifically to discuss the movement of people and goods during outbreaks. These early health conferences are now seen as the birthplace of global health diplomacy. And during these meetings, scholars and officials studied older Mediterranean models. They looked at Venetian practices. They examined leftover records from Italian ports. They traced policies back to the concept of quaranta giorni. And even though many documents from Ragusa had been lost, a few scattered references survived. Quietly, almost invisibly, Ragusa re-entered the story. Scholars noticed that the earliest official use of quarantine laws appeared in this small Adriatic republic, long before Venice made it popular. But by then the world was so focused on modern scientific breakthroughs, Pasteur, Koch, the birth of bacteriology, that few people cared about medieval origins. Ragusa regained a footnote in academic journals, but not the recognition it deserved. Yet in a way, that anonymity makes the story even more compelling. This medieval discovery didn't survive because of fame. It survived because it worked. It became part of global health not through force but through necessity. It lived on because humanity needed it. And what's even more extraordinary is how the same forgotten discovery re-emerged in the 20th and 21st centuries, during influenza outbreaks, SARS, Ebola, and more recently, a global pandemic that reminded the world of lessons first learned in Ragusa over 650 years ago. The world changed. Technology advanced. Medicine evolved. Yet the core principle remained exactly the same. Separate the sick from the healthy. Wait. Observe. Protect. Ragusa figured it out centuries before modern science finally proved why it worked. In the next part, we'll explore how the rediscovery of this medieval system influenced modern health responses, and how historians finally pieced together the true story behind the forgotten idea that saved millions. As the world entered the modern age, humanity began piecing together the foundations of scientific medicine. Microscopes, germ theory, sanitation, vaccination. But even as new discoveries transformed our understanding of disease, one ancient method kept quietly proving itself again and again: isolating the sick from the healthy. By the late 19th century, scientists finally understood why Ragusa's medieval strategy worked. The invisible killers, bacteria and viruses, were now visible under powerful microscopes. Robert Koch identified the agents behind tuberculosis and cholera. Louis Pasteur unlocked the relationship between microorganisms and infection. For the first time, the world could see the microscopic world that medieval people had only sensed through patterns. And what these new scientists discovered was astonishing. The incubation periods they measured in the lab almost perfectly confirmed the observations Ragusan physicians had made centuries earlier. The idea that disease takes time to manifest, a concept Ragusa used to set their 30 and 40-day waiting periods, turned out to be scientifically accurate for many major infections of their time. It was as if modern science suddenly shone a spotlight on a medieval truth the world had ignored for too long. Once germ theory became universally accepted, quarantine didn't just make sense, it became essential. Nations that once viewed it as superstition now built entire public health systems around it. Governments created health ministries. Ports established sanitary cordons. Hospitals developed isolation wards. And every time the world faced a new epidemic, Ragusa's forgotten logic reappeared. But something even more fascinating happened. Modern researchers started asking a simple but powerful question. Where did these systems originally come from? That single question opened a trail that led historians into dusty archives across the Adriatic. They searched monastic libraries, municipal vaults, old shipping logs, and diplomatic correspondence. They discovered fragments of decrees from the 14th century. They found records of merchants who had waited outside Ragusa's walls. They uncovered letters describing the lazarettos. And piece by piece, like reconstructing an ancient puzzle, the true story emerged. What they found was shocking. Ragusa's quarantine laws from 1377 were the earliest surviving official documents of their kind. This date predated Venice's famous quarantine island by decades. It predated major Italian health boards. It predated English plague houses. It predated even the widespread understanding of contagion. The world had to confront a forgotten fact. A small republic on the Adriatic had pioneered one of humanity's greatest medical defenses. But even with this discovery, Ragusa was still overshadowed. History had already credited Venice, Florence, Milan, and later Western nations with developing quarantine. Ragusa was often footnoted or mentioned briefly, acknowledged in academic circles, but absent from popular history. It's a phenomenon historians call the silence of small states. The contributions of smaller regions get overshadowed by larger, louder powers. Yet today more scholars are finally giving Ragusa the recognition it deserves. And here's the striking part. The more historians study the records, the more advanced Ragusa's system appears. They didn't just isolate travelers. They implemented sanitation patrols, infection mapping, port inspections, waste management protocols, and early data tracking. These were systems modern epidemiology would not formally define until centuries later. Consider this. During the COVID-19 pandemic, global health agencies used 14-day isolation periods, determined by the virus's incubation timeline. Medieval Ragusa, without labs or microscopes, used a combination of 30 and 40-day periods, which are still used today for certain diseases. They discovered effective incubation windows simply by observing the natural world. It raises an astounding question. How did medieval citizens, without any scientific tools, reach conclusions that align so closely with modern laboratory science? The answer lies in something rarely appreciated in historical storytelling: pattern literacy. People in pre-scientific societies were not ignorant. They were deeply observant. They lived intimately with nature. They noticed animals, seasons, behaviors, and timing in ways that modern people, surrounded by technology, often miss. Medieval Ragusa's success was not magic. It was attention. Patterns do not lie. Disease does not lie. Time does not lie. The human body gives clues when we are willing to watch carefully. Ragusa watched. And because they watched, they understood. But even as modern science validated Ragusa's method, the story of its disappearance remained mysterious. Why would the world forget something so powerful? Why weren't Ragusa's records preserved more carefully? Why didn't the discovery spread instantly? To answer this, historians point to 5 major causes. First, medieval Europe had no centralized medical authority. Every city governed itself. Even the church had no unified system for disease management. Ideas spread slowly and often selectively. Second, wars destroyed more knowledge than disease ever could. Ragusa's archives were damaged by earthquakes, fires, and political transitions during Ottoman rule. Third, Venice overshadowed Ragusa politically and culturally. People naturally credited innovations to the most powerful states. Fourth, quarantine wasn't glamorous. It didn't have heroic imagery. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet work, waiting, observing, preventing. History prefers battles, kings, and revolutions. And fifth, once germ theory emerged, early medieval experiments seemed irrelevant. Scientists celebrated their own discoveries, rarely looking back at medieval wisdom. This combination ensured that Ragusa's breakthrough remained largely hidden for centuries. But what makes this story extraordinary is not just the forgotten discovery, it's how the world returned to it out of necessity. In the 20th century, during outbreaks of polio, influenza, and tuberculosis, Countries once again turned to isolation and controlled contact. The idea had survived not because of legacy, but because it worked every single time humanity needed it. Then came the 21st century, when new global outbreaks forced the world to apply Ragusa's ancient logic on a scale never seen before. Airports screened travelers. Hospitals established isolation rooms. Borders implemented temporary controls. Countries revived old quarantine laws that had not been touched for decades. And for the first time in modern history, people began asking, where did this idea begin? That question led journalists and scholars back to the archives. Back to the Adriatic. Back to the city whose walls still stand, whose lazarettos still exist, and whose survival still defies the odds. Dubrovnik, ancient Ragusa, is now considered one of the birthplaces of public health. Tourists walk its stone walls unaware that beneath their feet lies the legacy of a medical revolution. In the old port, where ships once waited in forced silence, guides now tell stories of how the city once protected itself from invisible enemies. And yet, even with this renewed interest, the world still barely knows this story. A discovery that saved millions. A system that shaped centuries of medical policy. A breakthrough that arrived before science, survived through chaos, and re-emerged when the world needed it most. In the next part, we'll look deeper at how Ragusa's discovery changed the personal lives of ordinary medieval families, how it shaped daily routines, and how it altered the emotional and social fabric of a city constantly preparing for invisible threats. These human stories reveal why this discovery mattered so much, and why forgetting it was one of history's greatest tragedies. To truly understand how revolutionary Ragusa's discovery was, you have to visualize what daily life looked like inside the city during those years. This wasn't just a policy written on parchment. It reshaped families, communities, work, relationships, and even how people understood responsibility to one another. For many citizens, quarantine wasn't simply a health measure. It became a philosophy of life, one rooted in observation, caution, and collective protection. Imagine waking up in medieval Ragusa. The streets were narrow, paved with limestone, echoing the sound of footsteps at dawn. Merchants prepared their stalls by the port, fishermen unloaded their catches, and church bells signaled the start of the day. But unlike other cities of the era, Ragusa carried a quiet tension, a constant awareness that sickness could arrive at any moment. Every morning, health officers, known as cacamorti, walked the streets. These men weren't doctors but trained observers. They inspected courtyards, spoke to families, and watched for signs of fever, swelling, or sudden weakness. Their presence became a familiar part of daily life. Children would greet them, and adults would often share news about travelers or neighbors feeling ill. People understood that hiding symptoms endangered everyone. That cultural understanding was one of Ragusa's greatest strengths. In many other medieval cities, people hid sickness out of fear. Fear of being removed from their homes, fear of losing income, fear of stigma. Ragusa was different. The city cared for those in isolation. Food was delivered, housing was provided, and medical attention was guaranteed. While the system wasn't perfect, it gave citizens enough confidence to report symptoms honestly. Families in Ragusa learned to live with this cooperation. A mother noticing her child developing a fever would notify officials rather than conceal it. A merchant returning from a trip would voluntarily wait at a lazaretto before entering the city. Entire households participated in a shared understanding. One person's illness could become the city's tragedy if ignored. That mindset was centuries ahead of its time. But these policies also brought emotional challenges. Consider a family awaiting the return of a loved one. Ships approaching the port were not greeted with open arms. They were greeted with caution. People gathered along the walls, watching vessels from afar, squinting to identify familiar faces. Children waved eagerly, but they had to wait, days, sometimes weeks, before their fathers or brothers could step onto the streets. Those reunions were powerful events. A traveler emerging from quarantine wasn't greeted with suspicion, but with relief and joy. Citizens saw the system not as punishment but as protection. They understood that waiting meant life. But the hardest stories came from the lazarettos themselves. Travelers spent long days in simple stone rooms, surrounded by silence. Some were isolated even if they felt healthy. Others became ill during their waiting period, terrifying moments that reminded them of the fragility of life. One surviving letter from a quarantined merchant describes hearing coughing in the next room at night. He writes about praying that the illness would not reach him, about staring at the ceiling for hours, about the loneliness of waiting without knowing whether he would step back into the city or into the grave. Yet even in these fears there was order. Ragusa provided care, food, and oversight. Some merchants described quarantine as a period of reflection, time to rest, recover, and prepare for the responsibilities waiting inside the city. One sailor even wrote that the calm of the lazaretto helped him overcome seasickness by letting him regain balance on solid ground. And then there were the workers, the unsung heroes of the system. Quarantine guardians risked their health every day. They delivered supplies, monitored travelers, checked symptoms, and ensured no one escaped early. They understood the stakes. Many stayed in isolation quarters themselves between shifts to avoid bringing disease back home. Imagine the emotional weight of their work, the knowledge that a single mistake could open the door to devastation. These guardians weren't paid much. They weren't honored publicly. But they believed in the system, and their dedication saved countless lives. Inside the city, citizens developed new habits influenced by the quarantine philosophy. They washed hands more frequently, kept distance from the visibly ill, and avoided crowding in small, enclosed spaces. Women cleaning their homes paid more attention to ventilation and sanitation, something rare in that era. Markets developed structured layouts to improve airflow. Craftsmen began spacing their workstations slightly farther apart. All small things. All ahead of their time. Even the way people interacted socially changed. Greetings became less physical. Handshakes and embraces were reserved for close family. People instinctively stepped back when someone sneezed or coughed. Not because they fully understood contagion, but because their lived experience told them disease traveled person to person. It's incredible to think about how this invisible idea rewired the behavior of an entire population. Now picture the contrast with other cities of that era. In Florence, public bathhouses remained crowded during outbreaks. In Paris, doctors still performed bloodletting in communal rooms. In London, sick and healthy people lived in tight-packed neighborhoods without separation. In many German towns, the dead were stored briefly in churches before burial, exposing the healthy to the diseased. Against this chaotic backdrop, Ragusa's quiet discipline stands out as one of the most impressive examples of communal intelligence in medieval history. But this level of awareness came with emotional sacrifice. Children grew up understanding that illness meant separation. Parents often cried at the gates when loved ones were taken to isolation. Weddings were delayed due to fevers. Ships sometimes left before families could say goodbye because schedules were strict. Entire social calendars shifted around outbreaks. Yet citizens accepted these hardships because the alternative, burying friends and neighbors, was far worse. There's a recorded story of a Ragusan mother who insisted her son report a mild fever before his wedding day. She risked postponing the ceremony, risking the shame of canceling a feast already prepared, because she feared he might bring illness to the guests. Weeks later, her decision proved life-saving. 2 other relatives fell ill, but the wedding, when finally held, occurred safely. Stories like this reveal a remarkable truth. Ragusa's discovery wasn't just a medical advancement. It was a cultural transformation rooted in empathy, discipline, and collective responsibility. But even as the people of Ragusa perfected this lifestyle, the world outside their walls was changing rapidly. Trade routes shifted. Empires clashed. New wealth centers emerged. And slowly the influence of this small republic weakened. As Ragusa entered its final centuries, its greatest contribution, the discovery that saved millions, risked fading into silence. In the next part, we'll explore how Ragusa's system finally disappeared, the political events that buried its memory, and how historians ultimately rediscovered this forgotten miracle centuries later. As the medieval world slowly transitioned into the Renaissance and early modern period, Ragusa found itself surrounded by powerful forces shaping Europe's future. Trade was expanding, new scientific ideas were emerging, and political alliances shifted constantly. In this turbulent landscape, Ragusa's influence, though once significant, began to shrink. The problem wasn't that Ragusa failed. The problem was that the world changed faster than a small republic could adapt. Venice grew into a maritime superpower. The Ottoman Empire pushed westward. Spanish and Portuguese exploration shifted global trade away from the Mediterranean toward the Atlantic. As new economic centers emerged, the Adriatic's once vital shipping routes lost prominence. Ragusa remained stable and successful for centuries, but its days as a leading innovator were coming to an end. And with that gradual decline came the fading memory of its greatest discovery. The first major blow to Ragusa's legacy came in 1667, when one of the most devastating earthquakes in European history struck the city. Buildings collapsed. Fires erupted. Thousands were killed. The city's archives, containing centuries of records, medical notes, council decrees, and merchant logs, were heavily damaged. Many documents that described Ragusa's early quarantine system were lost forever. The people focused on rebuilding, not on preserving the past. A second blow occurred when political power shifted from small independent republics to large centralized states. Ragusa's influence in medical policy was overshadowed by the rising prestige of Italian universities, French academies, and later the scientific giants of the Enlightenment. Scholars in Paris, London, and Vienna rarely looked toward the Adriatic for inspiration. As Ragusa adapted its policies to survive under Ottoman protection, its achievements were overshadowed by political narratives written in larger capitals. Meanwhile, Venice's version of quarantine, though inspired by Ragusa, became more famous because Venice documented it meticulously and promoted it as a state innovation. Venetian scholars wrote about it. Venetian diplomats bragged about it. Venetian power ensured that its version of history spread across Europe. And so the world gradually forgot where the idea started. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Ragusa's name appeared only in small footnotes of narrow academic works. Even the city's lazarettos, once marvels of medieval engineering, became abandoned, overgrown, or repurposed. Travelers passing by saw only crumbling stones, unaware of the medical revolution that once began behind those walls. Yet the disappearance of Ragusa's memory wasn't just political or historical, it was psychological. Humanity tends to celebrate dramatic moments, not preventive ones. We tell stories about heroes who fight battles, not citizens who quietly prevent disaster. We remember pandemics but not the systems that reduced their impact. We honor armies, not the people who patiently waited in isolation to protect their communities. Quarantine saved more lives than most medieval armies ever did. But it didn't produce dramatic scenes fit for storytelling. It produced silence, silence where death might have been. And because silence doesn't write itself into legend, the world moved on. But history has a way of resurfacing when humanity needs it most. In the 20th century, during outbreaks of tuberculosis and influenza, scholars began tracing the origins of modern public health. They searched through port records, municipal archives, and medical treatises. In doing so, they came across scattered references to a medieval republic that had implemented something called a Trentino, a 30-day waiting period for travelers. This discovery puzzled them. It predated Venice's laws. It appeared more structured. It appeared more consistent. But the surviving fragments were incomplete. Without the missing archives destroyed in earthquakes or lost through political upheaval, historians struggled to understand the full picture. It wasn't until the late 20th and early 21st centuries that historians began piecing everything together. Digitization of archives allowed researchers to compare documents across different regions. Manuscripts long forgotten in monasteries surfaced. Ragusan diplomatic letters stored in Italian libraries were translated. Ottoman records referencing Ragusa's unusual health practices were uncovered. And suddenly a pattern appeared. The earliest known, organized, state-mandated quarantine system in medieval Europe originated not in Venice, not in Milan, not in London, but in Ragusa. The shock among scholars was immense. They discovered council records from 1377 describing the mandatory separation of newcomers. They found descriptions of lazaretto buildings constructed outside the city. They found laws outlining severe penalties for those who violated isolation. They found personal diaries from merchants describing their quarantine experience. Piece by piece, Ragusa re-emerged from the ashes of forgotten history. But the rediscovery wasn't just academic. It reshaped how we understand public health as a discipline. Ragusa hadn't stumbled into quarantine by accident. It built a system through observation, experimentation, adaptation, and communal cooperation. It created health inspectors, tracking systems, sanitation rules, and protocols for disease containment. This wasn't medieval improvisation, it was early epidemiology. And then something remarkable happened. As the world entered the 21st century and faced new pandemics, SARS, H1N1, Ebola, COVID-19, the strategies governments used were strikingly similar to Ragusa's medieval laws. Waiting periods, isolation of travelers, controlled entry at borders, monitoring of symptoms, separation of the sick from the healthy. Researchers pointed out that modern quarantine policies mirrored Ragusa's original framework more closely than Venice's. Ragusa's emphasis on observation, incubation periods, and structured isolation was almost identical to modern best practices. This realization forced historians, medical scholars, and policymakers to re-evaluate the entire narrative of quarantine. The world finally acknowledged the truth. The medieval discovery that saved millions was born in a small Adriatic republic, practiced by ordinary citizens, and forgotten for centuries until humanity once again needed it. But the rediscovery also sparked a deeper question. Why did Ragusa succeed when so many others failed? The answer lies not in architecture or laws but in culture. Ragusa survived because its people believed in collective responsibility. They understood that protecting one life protected all lives. They accepted temporary discomfort to ensure long-term survival. They trusted observation over superstition. They cooperated instead of resisting. In a world dominated by fear, they chose discipline. And that mindset saved more lives than any sword, any fortress, or any treaty in medieval history. Yet even now, the world rarely tells this story. It remains overlooked, overshadowed by louder histories. But understanding it matters, not just for remembering the past but for preparing for the future. Because the same forces that helped Ragusa discover quarantine, observation, cooperation, patience, are the same tools humanity will always need when facing new diseases. In the next part, the final section, we'll bring everything together. We'll explore the lasting legacy of Ragusa's forgotten discovery, how it shaped the evolution of global health, and why this medieval breakthrough still matters in the world we live in today. As we arrive at the end of this journey, one question still lingers in the background. The same question historians, doctors, and scholars have asked once the truth finally resurfaced. How could such an extraordinary medieval breakthrough, something that saved millions of lives, vanish into the shadows of history? The answer reveals something profound about both the strength and fragility of human knowledge. Ragusa's discovery was never wrapped in glory. There were no grand celebrations, no heroic sculptures, no royal decrees praising the idea. Quarantine was quiet. It was subtle. It was essentially just waiting, a behavior so simple that people didn't see it as an invention at all. And because it didn't create dramatic stories or visible monuments, the world overlooked it for centuries. But the impact of that quiet idea shaped the entire trajectory of public health and continues to echo through our modern world. Think about this. Every airport health check, every traveler screening, every isolation ward, every pandemic response protocol, every incubation study, every border control during outbreaks, every guideline encouraging distance when illness appears. All of it traces back to the core principle first formalized in Ragusa in 1377. But Ragusa's legacy goes deeper than quarantine laws. It introduced the world to an entirely new way of thinking, one centered on pattern recognition, communal responsibility, and the belief that society can prevent tragedy by learning from observation rather than reacting to catastrophe. That mindset laid the groundwork for what we now call public health, a discipline responsible for saving billions of lives across centuries. And perhaps the most remarkable thing is that Ragusa accomplished all this without understanding the science behind it. They didn't need microscopes, laboratories, or medical textbooks. They didn't need formal theories or modern terminology. All they needed was attention, cooperation, and discipline. It's ironic. In today's world, with endless access to information, people often struggle to trust medical advice. Yet in medieval Ragusa, where the unknown was far more terrifying, citizens chose trust. They accepted inconvenience for the good of others. They believed that their individual actions mattered. They believed in the wisdom of their community. That belief more than anything saved them. Now consider the ripple effect across time. When Venice adopted the practice and institutionalized it, the idea spread throughout the Mediterranean. When Italian city-states embraced quarantine boards, the concept traveled inland. When the Ottoman Empire observed Ragusa's success, versions of the practice crept eastward. When Europe faced cholera, nations revived the method once more. When the world confronted the influenza pandemic of 1918, the same principles guided many decisions. And when humanity faced new pandemics in the 21st century, the logic behind Ragusa's discovery formed the backbone of global response strategies. This medieval system lives inside every modern public health playbook, not because it was taught but because its effectiveness was rediscovered again and again. But behind every rediscovery was a forgotten origin. Ragusa rarely received credit. It was overshadowed by larger states, lost in political upheaval, buried by disasters, and neglected by historians who overlooked smaller nations. Its lazarettos decayed. Its council records burned or scattered. Its story fragmented. Yet here we are, centuries later, piecing together a narrative that was almost erased. And maybe that's the quiet beauty of Ragusa's legacy. The discovery didn't need fame to change the world. It didn't need recognition or glory. It simply needed to work. And because it worked, it survived in the only place that mattered, human behavior. When a mother keeps her sick child at home to protect neighbors. When a traveler waits for symptoms to pass before visiting family. When a community chooses caution during an outbreak. They're echoing the logic of Ragusa's forgotten wisdom. But beyond this scientific legacy lies the human story, a story of fear, resilience, observation, sacrifice, and hope. A story of ordinary people confronting invisible threats with extraordinary discipline. A story of a small republic standing alone against forces it couldn't fully understand, yet refusing to surrender to despair. Imagine the countless lives saved across centuries, not because someone invented a cure, but because a medieval community paid attention to the rhythms of sickness and acted accordingly. The farmers who lived through outbreaks that never reached their villages. The sailors who returned home safely because they waited in quarantine. The mothers who didn't lose their newborns to infection. The merchants who continued their trade because their city stayed healthy. The children who grew into adults because their communities protected them. Millions of these invisible victories trace back to Ragusa. And that's why this story matters, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a reminder of what humans are capable of when they work together. In a world often divided by borders, beliefs, and politics, Ragusa shows us that cooperation, not conflict, is what saves lives. It also reveals something humbling. Humanity tends to forget its greatest lessons until crisis forces us to remember them. Quarantine wasn't celebrated when it was invented. It wasn't preserved in golden archives. It wasn't honored with monuments. It simply lived on in the shadows, waiting for humanity to need it again. And every time the world faced a new pandemic, Ragusa's ancient wisdom resurfaced, as if whispering through history. Slow down. Separate. Observe. Protect each other. The medieval discovery that saved millions was not a scientific breakthrough, a heroic invention, or a miraculous cure. It was a reminder of something deeply human, our ability to look at patterns, learn from experience, and change behavior to protect our communities. And maybe that's why the story stayed hidden for so long. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't attributed to kings or empires. It belonged to the people, ordinary citizens who quietly did the right thing. Today, as we look back, we finally see them. We finally understand their genius. And we finally recognize that a forgotten idea from a small medieval republic shaped the survival of civilization as we know it. So as we close this journey, think about the weight of that discovery. Think about the millions of lives stitched into the fabric of this forgotten miracle. Think about the resilience of knowledge that refuses to die, even when the world forgets its name. And now, just like those medieval citizens who passed their wisdom forward without expecting credit, if you enjoyed this journey and found value in it, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Your support is what keeps these stories alive and helps us uncover more hidden chapters of history that shaped our world. Thanks for staying with me through this long and remarkable adventure. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep learning from the past.